invite our next presenter to the podium, who's Gabrielle Samuel from King's College London. Gabby will be presenting on reframing research ethics frameworks to include environmental sustainability. Thanks very much.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Gabby, and as Joe said, I'm based in the UK. I'm a sociologist, but with a background in bioethics. I want to talk today about reframing research ethics frameworks to include environmental sustainability, so it's slightly different from some of the other talks. My background is generally exploring the types of issues that we've been talking about today and yesterday, looking at genomics, AI, digital health, and the ethical and social issues that related to them. And as I was doing this work, I was looking at the AI ethics guidelines, of which there are many. Effie spoke about them yesterday. And I noticed that there was a lack of discussion about the environmental impacts of AI technologies, the adverse environmental impacts. And so it made me think about if, then how we could start to think about them in our ethical discussions when we consider AI in health research. So the format of the talk is that I will describe to you, just in case you don't know, what the adverse environmental and health impacts are of AI health research. Then I will argue that there is a need for normative consideration of these impacts. I will explain that historically we haven't really thought about these in research ethics governance frameworks. And then I will propose a modification of Emmanuel et al.'s 2018 Research Ethics Governance Framework so that it can include this, similar to what Brenda did just previously. And then I will describe what this could potentially look like in practice, bearing in mind that this is all a research in progress and would welcome very much any type of feedback. So this is the anatomy of AI, which you won't be able to see in detail, but it was developed by Kate Crawford and Vladan Holler, who I think I might be pronouncing their name incorrectly. But I think the main point I wanted to get through this very complicated diagram is that AI is based on data, and data is seen as something that's virtual. We use virtual metaphors to describe it, like being in a cloud, but actually it has materiality, and that materiality has physical adverse impacts, environmental impacts. So these impacts relate to, for example, the very high energy demands that are used during AI research. So to give you an example, ICT sector has the same energy consumption as the aviation industry, just to kind of put it into perspective. And a typical algorithm, if used with NLP, natural language processing, for perhaps medical records would be equivalent to flying from San Francisco to New York. Very roughly. So that just gives you a sense of the energy consumption related to the data storage, but particularly the data use when we're doing the processing with the AI. AI methodologies, because of their reliance on digital technologies, have a reliance on mining and rare minerals in particular. And this picture can describe the types of environmental impacts that come from this, including biodiversity type impacts, but also environmental justice concerns for those that are working or living around the mines. So I think that's really, really important. And there's a huge amount of e-waste associated with different digital technologies. So I don't have the figures here, but I can get them if you want, but it's astronomical. And about only 20% of digital technologies are recycled. So think how often you go through like your digital phones, your laptops, etc. And that e-waste typically ends up in lower to middle income countries. It's a long, complex chain, but eventually in lower to middle income countries in e-waste dump sites. And communities emerge around these dump sites where they, in very unregulated fashion normally, come in to try and extract the minerals from the digital technologies using acid baths and so forth so that they can sell the minerals. And so researchers have come in to assess the health impacts of this and shown that carcinogenic substances and toxic substances are in pregnant women's, children's, men's bodies over 100 times what we would consider as safe standards. So again, raising environmental justice issues. And this is a book by Josh Lipowski that argues that e-waste shouldn't just be at the end. We should consider e-waste throughout the whole process of the AI lifecycle, from mining to manufacturing. There are toxic emissions, there's liquid toxins, and we should consider these e-waste and really think about these as environmental justice concerns. There's also other issues, water scarcity you may have come across. So data is used in data centers, which, for example, you might have seen in the media recently, the data centers in the US where they're having droughts, the water that they need to cool down the data centers is being siphoned off from, for example, farmers that need the water to grow their crops. There's a lot of issues that kind of need to be taken into account when thinking about data. So I argue that the adverse environmental and particularly the health impacts that come from this of AI research is particularly problematic when these technologies are used in the health context, because there appears to be an internal contradiction between the goal of improving health outcomes and the environmental and health risks due to the environmental impact. So typically in my research, I ask, health for whom? And very often those least likely to benefit from our health research, not always, are the ones that are most exposed to those risks. So as such, AI health research has a special interest in addressing its adverse environmental and health impacts, not only as a matter of international priority, but also as a commitment to health. But if we look at research ethics frameworks, what we'll see is that there's no real discussion about the environment. There's implicit mentioning, but that's about it. Because historically, they've, as we know, revolved around individual research participants and also communities and communitarianism. And Brenda spoke a lot about the community aspect, so I'm not going to go into it there. But what I wanted to make the point of is that our moral gaze has focused only on humans. So we need to question, how can we think about the environmental impacts of AI, of digital technologies, if we only have our moral gaze on humans? So I would argue there's two ways of coming at it, depending on your philosophical reasoning. So one is to keep our moral gaze on humans and argue that the environmental impacts that are caused by AI, digital technologies, affect human health. So those humans can remain, that we can expand our moral gaze to include those humans within it, and that those humans have value. Alternatively, you may prefer to consider the environment as having intrinsic value, as well as humans as having intrinsic value, in which case you'd be seen as promoting ecocentric ethics. So when you only think as your moral gaze is focusing on humans, that's anthropocentric, otherwise it's ecocentric. But both would work in a research ethics framework, such as this. So this is my modified research ethics framework. So I've only taken 4 points from Emmanuel and colleagues, because these are the ones that I felt needed tweaking. So taking the social value one, which Brenda mentioned, it says that we need to consider the adverse effects must be minimized of our research endeavors. And I'd like to just make that explicit, that this includes the environment that needs to be considered. For respect for participants and community partnerships, I would like to add respect for the environment as well. And that means being attentive to the adverse environmental impacts of using digital technologies during the research and taking steps to reduce them as much as possible. For fair participant selection, I would like to split this into two. So the fair collection, storage and use of data is what we've been talking about for the last couple of days. But then to also add in the fair consideration of those affected by the research, including those affected during the manufacture, use and disposal of digital tools used during the research process. And then finally, the favourable risk-benefit ratio, similarly adding in not just those partaking in research and or affected by research outcomes as being part of that balancing equation, but also those that are affected by the manufacturing, use and disposal of digital technologies. So how could this work in practice? So I would envisage that there's two ways. One, it could be useful for researchers and research ethics committees, and secondly, it could be useful for research policymakers. Now, I'm a sociologist, so I think the latter is way, way, way more important than the former, and we've heard about a whole range of issues with overburdened research ethics committees and researchers for trying to address these issues. And micro-level issues are probably going to have least likely effects than more institutional, meso and macro-level changes. But at the researcher and research ethics committee level, there are things that can be done. We can ask where data is stored, how data is stored. Please ask me about this if you've got any questions. How we can optimize algorithms for environmental considerations and considerations of obsoleteness. And there are guidelines that have been developed around this, which there's a reference there and also in my paper in the book, so that can kind of address some of these questions. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is simplistic. So a lot of my research is exploring the issues that are involved in doing this, related to responsibilities, related to value tensions, related to lower to middle income countries not having data infrastructures or data storage, or other issues that they need to address, like data sovereignty. So I understand that it is very complex, as I said, work in progress. But on the other end of the scale, research policymakers, the most important thing is to understand that increasing digital efficiency will not necessarily reduce the adverse environmental impacts unless we put constraints in place. If we don't put constraints in place, then increasing efficiency is likely to increase consumption. So it is a paradox that shows up. And we need to therefore constrain the resources that we give. This is a little bit controversial, to AI researchers. So I agree with AI research, but I'm just saying that if we could share resources, it's a bold statement, more equally between research proposals that use lower tech methodologies that are less sexy and address the social determinants of health, which have been shown to be more important necessarily in health outcomes than necessarily big tech solutions, that would go some way to starting to address some of these concerns. Bold statements, I say, they require a lot of unpacking, but I think there's something to be said for some of the discussions we had yesterday, or I had with the various people about, and we heard this morning, about questioning, do we need big tech solutions, sexy solutions for particular research outcomes, or are there other ways of getting to that point? And who is it that makes those decisions, which is really key. I think I'm running out of time. So quickly, limitations. There are still really incomplete data sets about the environmental impacts of specific AI methodologies. Carbon calculators are being developed left, right, and centre that you can use to measure the energy impact, but they're carbon-centric, and they don't necessarily consider all environmental sustainability. My research is also exploring how environmental sustainability needs to also integrate with social sustainability. But I would argue that even though there is uncertainty about the environmental impacts of specific research topics, we should govern it in uncertainty. And by that, I mean we should always look to be decreasing the consumption of our research practices in line with these issues, whether or not we know the exact numbers. So I'll leave it there. I hope I didn't go too much over time. Thank you very much, and I welcome questions.
Thank you very much, Gabby. That was really insightful, I thought. I know about everybody else in the room, but when I read Gabby's paper first, I thought, like, why haven't we been talking about this all along in various areas of research that we do? So maybe a topic for future GFBR. Great, so questions or comments? Yes, in the front.
Yeah, thank you, Gabrielle. It's wonderful. I was just thinking loud, if we can have an AI technology which is self-censoring, right? It's taking care of ESG. If that kind of a technology comes, then what would be your opinion about the...
Self-sustaining in...
Self-censoring, sorry. If the AI itself self-censors it, if, let's say, its impact on the environment is beyond the standards that are being set, then it itself regulates, the AI itself regulates itself.
That sounds like technological solution.
Yes, because that is what AI is, that it learns from the data and then takes decisions.
Yeah.
So if the data is telling it that there are environmental impacts of this type of technology, and then it starts self-censoring it. Is it complicated?
Interesting. I'm not sure if it makes 100% sense, but are you suggesting that the AI can work out where its environmental impacts are and decrease them?
Yes.
That would be an amazing feat, like massive, because...
So, but then we would prefer to have that AI?
And I'm not against AI. I feel like I need to just say that. I know that it came across that I was, but I'm all for using AI technologies where they can help, and they're enablers in every sector, and they can do so many things. But I think we mustn't see them as win-win, like if we all move to digital, we all move to data, problem solved. Because actually, there have been predictive models that show if all other sectors sort out their environmental impacts, but the digital sector doesn't, by I think it's 2050, about a third of our carbon emissions will be from the digital sector alone, because we're moving more and more to digital. So I'm not against moving to digital. I'm just saying when we do it, we need to be really careful about the fact that there are these adverse environmental impacts, and sometimes we need to think about mitigating them or not rushing to use AI without considering if it actually has some form of social value. So I don't think that answers your question, but I think your question sounds like it would be a really amazing feat. And if an AI could regulate itself to not have any environmental impacts, I'd say, and what about the social impacts and how does that fit in? And yeah, sorry, I'm not sure that really answered your question.
So thank you, Gabby. Fantastic talk and something for us to be really sensitive to and aware of. So we were updating our ethics book this year, and we added chapters on AI. We added a chapter on climate change, and initially started looking at the impact of climate change on health, and then realized there's also an impact of healthcare, the healthcare industry, on the environment. And so we added that dimension to the chapter. And likewise, in the AI chapter, we considered the impact of AI on the environment. So I think these are really important aspects that we need to consider. And of course, it increases the work of research ethics committees, because are we gonna tick a box for community engagement, then tick a box for climate, sensitivity to environmental impact, etc. But these are the important considerations as we move forward. Thank you.
I think they are, and the health sector, on average, is 5% contributes 5% to global national emissions for each country, but that's an average. So I think developed countries it's much higher. America's US is like 8%. I think the UK is about 6%. I think lower to middle income countries are lower. So it is a huge amount that needs to be changed. And in the health sector, there's a huge amount of activity. I know at least in the UK, which I know is leading the way, the UK NHS, but also in other countries. But in the research sector, not so much. And in all my research, when I speak to health researchers and I ask them about these issues, they say, well, we don't really need to worry about it because either our environmental impacts are too low, so appealing to worse problems, or they see health researchers having a free pass because they're doing health research and that's intrinsically good. And that seemed to kind of counter anything else. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but I think the work's definitely started.
Yes.
Well, thank you for this talk. It was very interesting. I just wanted to ask you, I have seen these models that some American universities, for example, are developing, in which they're measuring, for example, the kind of hardware that is being used, the cloud provider, the number of hours in which these systems are being used in order to detect that kind of impact and energy consumption that you were just mentioning. I think the OECD recently published that. We use that in Colombia for the AI ethics framework that we have. So each project measures the energy consumption, especially within the public sector. Do you think something like this can be used in the health research and in the use of AI, like this kind of metrics, the numbers you're using to measure energy consumption? Do you see something like that becoming a standard or something that is going to be used?
Like carbon calculator, to assess?
For example, yes.
Yeah. So carbon calculators are being developed. So the guidelines that are on my slides and in my paper, that's linked to a particular carbon calculator that can be used for, I think that was done around genomics research at least. So carbon calculators are great, but they're very carbon-centric, so they don't consider other environmental impacts. They also move our moral gaze on carbon, but away from social issues, which is another issue altogether. And also, they hide the messiness of the data that comes behind the carbon calculator. So actually, just as we were talking about today and yesterday about the uncertain data that goes into developing AI algorithms, it's similar with carbon trackers, right? So they often use data sets that might not be up to date, or that it's got missing information or missing data, because you need to work out the energy. It depends. So it depends where you're running your algorithm. If you're running it in Australia, where they're mainly fossil fuel, then it's going to have a really high fossil fuel energy consumption. But if you're running it in a country where you're mainly serving renewable energy, then your energy consumption in terms of carbon emissions will be much lower. So there are many, many factors that will affect your particular energy consumption. And carbon calculators try to pick up as much as possible, but we shouldn't, again, see them as, well, I've dealt with that problem over. And there's some really nice ethnographic work that's being conducted in France at the moment, where they're going into labs, not health, all different types of labs, and speaking to people that are using a carbon calculator that's suggested by a funding body in France to see how they're interacting with it in practice. And what he's found, this colleague, is that you do the carbon calculation and then you just carry on as normal. It doesn't change your behaviour at all. So it doesn't achieve the goals of what you aim for it to do. But I suppose it's a first step, and I think it's, yes. So in short, yeah, they're great, but a long line of issues that relate to them.
Great, thanks very much, Gabby. I think we'll just open up for a few general questions for anybody within either Brenda, Gabby, or Ahmed. So let me get Cesar, and then we can come.
Okay, thank you. Just on the last presentation, the first thing, I just wanted to say thanks very much. It's very good because actually one of the biggest e-waste sites for disposal of electronic waste is in Accra, where you have generations almost living just on e-waste sites and using their hands to basically pick out metals from destroyed cell phones and all that. And it's a great environmental problem that the government has been struggling to deal with for many years now. But the issue is about the carbon trackers. That's my question. And I think you're right in saying that focusing on carbon actually limits our perception of the dimensions of the problem. But if we want to take in the social impact into consideration, what do you think would be useful metrics to be able to measure? Just like we have the carbon emissions, you can at least give some numbers to them, whether they are exact or not. But for example, livelihoods that are destroyed, the social impact, the health damage, can we begin to think of some metric that we can use about that, or is there one in existence already?
So when it comes to metrics for what I'd call social sustainability, they are very much lacking, and that's one of the reasons why the focus has been on carbon as opposed to social issues. But also I think they're lacking because investment's going into trying to address environmental issues because it's seen as a sexy thing to do, as opposed to social justice issues, which are seen as less interesting for researchers. The short answer is, so therefore, there are very, very few metrics designed to assess these social issues that you mentioned. And I do believe, on one hand, I believe we need metrics to help us better articulate these issues. On the other hand, I would point to the messiness that goes behind metrics and what metrics hide. So every time we choose a metric, we're hiding other issues. And we need to be very careful about, if we're going to use metrics, what gets lost in the process. And so we're doing a lot of work now trying to think about how we can kind of land these types of issues in policy and trying to push for both quantitative but also qualitative type case studies to be used as evidence as well, which is probably not going to work because policymakers don't like them. But this idea that metrics need to be, they need to come alongside the qualitative aspects as well, and that qualitative evidence is just as important as metrics. So I think that we need metrics, but we need to go further than metrics.
Great. I think we have time maybe for 2 more questions, and we should go to our breakouts. But Florencia, yes.
Okay. Well, I wanted to really congratulate you, Gabi. I thought it was really interesting to include this kind of thinking, which is more subtle. It brings, I think, it's a deep thinking issues and puts in perspective technology, something that we should do all the time. It's not just yeah, I have problems because in Spanish it's the other way around. And also it's funny because I think the first article I've written when I inaugurated the journal in research in bioethics in 1996 spoke about sexy and boring issues. And I think that is exactly what you are also putting here in front. And it's not just saying it's wrong, it's saying we have to think both sides. Technology might be really good, but take care, there are some issues that have to deal with infrastructure, for example, that are really fundamental for our countries, for LMICs. So beware of what are you introducing and how, and I think this is very important also for all of us to remember that we have to go more subtle in the way we think. So thanks a lot. It was a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think you articulated it much better than me, so thank you.
All right, one last comment, Agatha.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much once again for all the talks. My question is to Gabby for thought-provoking talk. While you were explaining us the implication of this, technological evolution, the pollution is really related, I think, to the amount of data produced, right? And where to store them, and each country having to deal with this. And I was wondering whether solutions or ideas related to open data, for example, I don't know if you looked into it, could help somehow into, reducing this environmental issue, in the sense that we talked yesterday and this morning as well about issues related to accessing data and sharing data, right? But there is also, I think, a positive aspect related to accessing data across country, which could be not reproducing and restarting from scratch, building up, right, data sets. And so I think if we could connect data sets and as well as use what others have worked on instead of restarting from scratch, we could reduce potentially the amount of data that we need and that we have to, build. That's a really great point. So when I went to speak to health researchers in the UK about how they thought about these issues, they all pretty much said, well, we don't think about these issues. But then on reflection, when they were thinking more about their practices, one of the practices that they felt aligned quite well on reflection was that open science type practices. So exactly what you're saying, this idea that if data is more accessible, we can check the reproducibility, we can use it so we don't have to go and collect samples again. And that's the rhetoric for biobanking, right? We can reduce costs, reduce access, give ease to researchers to collect data more easily and reduce environmental costs by putting all the data together. So 100%. But I worry about the rebound effect, which is what I was talking about earlier. So rebound effects are when basically you make something more efficient, so open science, but actually behavioural and social effects lead to not the outcome that you were hoping for. And when it backfires, you have the opposite outcome. So to give you an example, you build a motorway to decrease traffic, but then you end up with more cars on the road. So these happen all the time, and economists think that this is great because it normally stimulates the economy. But actually in the environmental sector, it can have quite bad environmental impacts. So if I think about open science, then I think about bigger data sets because we have more accessible data. So we need bigger algorithms to run on these data sets. And we can therefore develop more powerful, more energy hungry algorithms, which will then burn more energy. And it will also, I'm not saying it will, but we need to consider that therefore we just want to collect more and more data and put more and more data in a more open access format, because we've become so obsessed that data is going to answer all of our social problems that we have and health problems, that we just need to collect more and more data. So I agree, and I think open access is brilliant and I'm all for it, but I'm also very cautious that is it just another part of that our belief that there's a moral obligation to collect more data without questioning why we're collecting data and about other ways of kind of addressing problems. Like, we know that poverty is a huge issue. We don't need data to find that out. We could just, resource infrastructures to help people get out of poverty. Sorry, I'm going off on one, sorry.
All right, I think we're a bit over time, so I'm afraid I'll have to cut off questions. But thank you, Gabby, thank you, Brenda, thank you, Ahmed. Thank you all for your questions, especially Florence for having me now think about sexy technology waste dumps. So,